Hello and welcome to Frontier Finance, the flagship series of Fasset Islamic, where we will be engaging with thought leaders and experts from around the world to get their insights into disruptive technologies, the future economy, and Islamic finance. My name is Gareth Lewis, and today I'll be your host as we go back to the future. That's right, we're going to take a tour through the recent history of Islamic banking and finance with two of the most prominent figures in the world on the topic today. Plus, we'll take a leap into the future and discuss the next generation of finance, including Web3, digital assets, and tokenization. First of all, allow me to introduce and welcome Mufti Faraz Adam, who is a globally recognized Sharia scholar and Islamic finance expert. He is the founder of Amana Advisors and the director of Fasset Islamic. Most importantly, he's my homeboy from the East Midlands of the United Kingdom and close ally here at Fasset, where we're building out the premier digital asset proposition for the emerging markets world. Each episode, Mufti Faraz will be joined by experts and thought leaders in the space. And so no better way to kick off the Frontier Finance series than to introduce Daud Vicary Abdullah. Welcome to the show, Daud. Mufti Faraz, how are you?
All good, thank you.
So allow me to introduce Daud, if you will, a little bit about yourself. Daud Vicary Abdullah, Managing Director of DVA Consulting, the former President and CEO of INSEF, the Global University of Islamic Finance. He's been in the finance and consulting industry for over 47 years, with significant experience in Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. Since 2002, he's focused exclusively on Islamic finance, where he's contributed to several books on the subject and has co-authored a book on Islamic finance entitled Islamic Finance, Why It Makes Sense, a question which I will hope you'll be answering a little bit later on, Daud. He's also a frequent speaker and commentator on matters relating to Islamic finance. Prior to INSEF, Daud was the global Islamic finance leader with Deloitte. He was also previously the acting CEO of ASEAN Finance Bank, an Islamic bank based in Malaysia, and was the first managing director of Hong Leong Islamic Bank. He's a member of the Chartered Institute of Islamic Finance, a fellow of CPA Australia, a distinguished fellow of the Islamic Banking and Finance Institute of Malaysia, and a former board member of the Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institutions, IOFI. He chaired the Islamic Finance Advisory Board at the Astana International Financial Center, 2018 to 19, and currently Daud chairs the advisory boards at IslamicMarkets.com and, of course, here at Fasset. He's also a board member at Finalytics, Pay Halal, and Digital Bank, and is a founding trustee at Other Dots, and continues to advise numerous organizations around the world on Islamic and sustainable finance. Daud, you've been very busy.
Well, I try to keep as busy as possible. I'm largely retired now, but people still look to me for sort of advice and guidance. But it's been a rich and interesting career, and I've been extremely fortunate in where I've been able to go and what I've been able to learn along the way. So I'm at that stage of my life where I'm always happy to share and do what I can to contribute and to mentor. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for that splendid introduction.
My pleasure, and welcome to the show. I have to start, and I hope you don't mind me saying, when you see your name and your decorated career spanning several decades, your face might not be one that one would expect to see. Quite an interesting and atypical journey, if I may say so. Can you tell us how did you get to this point?
That's a great question, but it's not the first time I've been asked it, and I've been asked it in some interesting situations. But if I can go back just over 30 years, 1992, I was running my own business then, doing consulting around my area of expertise, as it then was, which was process re-engineering in banks. And I was process re-engineering one of the largest banks here in Malaysia for a systems integrator and systems supplier. And whilst we were doing that, the central bank in Malaysia decided it was going to expand Islamic finance. It started Islamic finance or Islamic banking with Bank Islam in 1983. And it had a license to operate for 10 years without competition. And 1993 was looming. And the central bank here decided to do two things. One was to set up a second fully fledged Islamic bank to act as a competitor. And the second thing it decided to do was to encourage Islamic windows. So it issued an instruction that all domestic Malaysian banks had to open an Islamic window. And I remember being called into the boardroom at the bank I was working at. And I said, well, I thought it was going to be about, the project and how it was progressing. And what they said to me was interesting. They said, we've been instructed by the central bank to open an Islamic window. Can you, as you're the banking expert, can you tell us what to do, please? I'd never heard of Islamic banking at that stage, had no idea what it was. And grasping at straws, I looked out of the window of the boardroom, which overlooked a particularly iconic building in downtown Kuala Lumpur, the old railway station, which was built in the Moorish style, and pointed at a window over there and said, do you mean something like that? And the board didn't really see the funny side of that, but said, can you go away and find out what you can? And that's when my journey started. And it's a long journey. I was fortunate enough to find somebody at Bank Islam who was prepared to assist and help me, who I still see for breakfast once a week. He's 5 years my senior, and I regard him my mentor. He was one of the founding fathers of Islamic finance in this country. And the implications for me were that I was seeing the world through a completely different lens. I had no idea about anything in Islam or Islamic finance, other than, I guess, a classical British education was, well, we fought crusades against Saladin and the rest. But it piqued my interest, and I researched further, and about a year later, I converted to Islam. And the rest, they say, is history.
It certainly is an interesting and unique journey that you've been on, Daud. Thank you for sharing that with us. You mentioned there about the early 90s. Was that was the point that you reverted to Islam?
Correct. Yes.
And since that point, those years ago, can you give us a sense of some of the key milestones and key achievements and leaps and bounds that you've seen during that time in Islamic banking and finance?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll probably pick two or three. During the 90s, there wasn't a huge amount happening. It was all quite localized. Banks were opening up. The challenge was one of really educating people what it was and how to actually run the place and also in some ways educating the Sharia scholars as to what the business was about. I mean, they were pretty good on the Sharia law, but the business. So the 90s was a kind of I'll call it muddling our way through. What changed things was there was a bit more of a focus on the capital market side and the issuance of sukuk, which started happening in the late 90s. And that focused the attention of lawyers and financiers who were looking at the capital market side of things. We then got into the noughties, as they're now called. And we had the tragic events of what is called 9/11. And one of the fallouts from 9/11 was a desire by many Middle Eastern countries to withdraw money from the United States because they weren't sure how safe their money was in the US. And that provided quite a significant stimulus to the industry. And around that time, I was a partner in Deloitte, and I set up the Islamic Finance Center of Excellence for Deloitte in 2004. A few years after 9/11, there was huge resistance within the firm. And I guess they won't mind me saying this. And it was largely the fallout of 9/11. And you couldn't get past the word Islamic, before being thrown out of the room. But when they realized that there was business and I was making money in Kuala Lumpur selling advisory services and consulting, at the end of the day, money speaks. And we built up a significant amount of momentum. I think Malaysia also has to be given credit for introducing a Sharia governance framework and also introducing the rule in early 2005, where a Sharia scholar could not sit on multiple boards. If you were sitting on the board of a bank as a Sharia scholar, you had to stay with that bank. You could be on the board of a Takaful company. And a lot of the rest of the world sort of looked in amazement at Malaysia and said, what are you doing? Because I think I remember one study that was done by a company based out of Germany called Funds at Work discovered that the average number of Sharia positions that the leading Sharia scholars at the time, and I'm going back now close to 20 years, was 150 positions on Sharia boards. And Bank Negara decided that this was going to be the way forward, that they didn't want to create a potential area for conflict of interest with people sitting on multiple boards, but also they wanted to stimulate a progression of getting younger Sharia scholars into the industry and building up a pipeline. And what's interesting about those decisions made in early 2005 is most of the rest of the world has now followed what Malaysia did or has done. And I think that was a very significant step. I think there's been a natural progression in raising funds in the capital market. There are still some issues and challenges, and quite a significant opening up to the ideas around Islamic finance in places that initially you wouldn't have thought of. Most people were thinking it's a Middle Eastern thing, which to an extent it was. Malaysia took great strides. Indonesia was sort of getting involved in it, but it was not doing as much in terms of pure involvement as Malaysia was. Indonesia has now, come forward in leaps and bounds. But you got a good deal of interest in some places that you wouldn't think of. I remember in 2008 being involved with the stock exchange and the Ministry of Finance in Brazil in helping Brazil issue its first corporate sukuk to fund abattoirs that slaughtered animals in a Sharia compliant way. Why? Because Brazil wanted to look at the whole supply chain and said, we are the world's largest providers of halal meat to the world, and we want to do the things properly. And I got involved in that largely because I spent a year of my life in Brazil in the 80s, and I spoke reasonably fluent Brazilian Portuguese. That was just happened to be happenstance. You also got quite a lot of interest in European countries. The UK, and Mufti Faraz will know this pretty well, started getting involved very early on, late 80s, early 90s, but it really gained momentum after the central bank under Eddie George changed some of the rulings to facilitate Islamic finance. You also got a lot of interest and a lot of business. And I remember when I was managing partner at Deloitte for Islamic finance, one of our largest operation centers was in Luxembourg, largely because of the asset management and investment management that was going on out of there. And there was huge interest in Sharia compliant instruments there. So, the journey's been varied and interesting. And I think, in recent years, or at least since 2015, there's been a great surge of interest around sustainability. And we're still, if you like, proving our case or demonstrating our case that Islamic finance is extremely relevant because the objectives of Islam, the Maqasid al-Sharia, are very much aligned to the objectives of the 15 SDGs. And there's a great deal of work which has gone on extensively in the last 7 or 8 years to demonstrate that. And more people are getting on board with that and ignoring, shall we say, the Islamic side of things, in the sense that they're not as put off as they used to be by the word Islam or Islamic. but actually identifying the values. So we've made a little bit of progress there, but there's still a great deal of work to do. That's probably enough for now.
That's perfect, Dawood. And I would like to come back to the points that you've made there about Malaysia and Southeast Asia being trailblazers, if you will, in this space, but also come back to that point you make about the SDGs and the principles of Islamic banking and finance transcending faith and what that means to non-Muslim people in non-Muslim markets. Let me come back to that point. And let me go to Mufti Faraz next and ask Mufti Faraz, compared to Southeast Asia and Malaysia, how are you seeing, or how have you seen the developments in the West, particularly in the UK, over the last 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Dawood probably would be better at responding to this, given his kind of like reach and understanding of the markets. But just from my perspective, I would say a lot of Islamic finance has been concentrated in banking and capital markets, right? For the most part, in this side of the world. What we're seeing now in the last 4 or 5 years is many non-banks, right, coming to the scene. That's where really the penetration is happening from the grassroots level. And that's where the most exciting part of Islamic finance is, right? Because up until now, Islamic finance has been, for the most part, banks, insurance companies, and capital markets. And that's why most of the numbers that we see in the stats and the data, whenever you see Islamic finance equals this many trillion dollars of assets, for the most part, that is capturing banks and capital markets assets, right? But really, we should be looking at how many lives have we impacted as Islamic finance, or even looking at how many people have we saved from riba, which is one of the core objectives of Islamic finance, right? So the way we measure Islamic finance needs to be rethought of. And that's what's really happening right now. I see many youngsters in the new generation seeking meaning in Islamic finance. They want to find a purpose behind Islamic finance. And the sustainability discussion is really key to that, because until now, we've always been playing catch up, right? So SDGs, and we've got the ESGs and the ethical screening and all these things. It's like as though in Islamic finance, we have this fear of missing out complex. We're always doing catch up. But if we really look into Islamic finance, it's all there. As Dawood mentioned, it's all there. All we need to do is just show and bring it in a meaningful, in a purposeful, and a coherent way to the world. Like, this is what Islamic finance is all about. You don't have to worry about the Islamic term, but look under the bonnet and look at the substance that's there. It really has value for everyone, regardless of where you're from, right? And that's why I think it's so interesting right now, the movements happening in the world.
Thanks, Mufti Faraz. And to your point, I've heard before several times when people have substituted the word Islamic for ethical and described the practice and the principles and the substance as ethical finance. So, Dawood, a question for you. And perhaps we can aim it at someone like myself, who's a white, British, non-Muslim guy. Why would ethical finance or Islamic finance, what should it mean to me? Why should I be interested in this space?
It's a great question, and I'm 72 years old, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask the question, but I'll draw on my experience. And the reason I say the age difference is that the younger generation, certainly from my perspective, are starting to ask much more serious questions, as Mufti Faraz was indicating, about how their money is used and where it is used and why it is used in that particular way. And the appeal of Islamic finance is very much around the ethical values. Now, it's neither the time nor place, and I'm not sure it's particularly relevant to sort of argue about, we're ethical, everybody else isn't. I don't think that's the argument you enter into, and I've certainly never entered into that argument. I think you have to demonstrate the ethics that are there and the value that is there, and why an alternative system such as Islamic finance is gaining momentum. And you can look at this in terms of the way in which social finance is being mobilized in the modern age, and also take a look historically about how great empires of the past, if I look at the Ottoman Empire, mobilized Islamic finance very effectively in order to provide education in order to provide schools, hospitals, and so on for everybody using social finance. How indeed most Western universities use as the basis for their trust funds the Islamic concept of waqf. If you look historically back to the 13th century, the Crusaders brought back the concept of waqf, and that helps establish the first college at Oxford University, Merton College, Oxford. If you look at the trust deed, which is the foundation of every single Western university, including Harvard, it's an Islamic waqf. And it's the expression of understanding those values and understanding what Islamic finance can bring, rather than being dismissive. Education is key to helping people understand, because sadly we live in a world of the soundbite and social media where people can be very, very dismissive very, very quickly. But if you stop and listen and engage, then there's always an opportunity to explain historically. And I'll come back to, a comment that you made earlier, that, you're surprised to see me doing Islamic finance. And if I may, I'll just tell a very, very brief story. It won't take more than 30 seconds, but I was at INSIF, and we were asked by a leading US university that was visiting Malaysia to put on a half-day presentation on what Islamic finance was. This was about a decade ago. Actually, yeah, a little bit more than a decade ago. They were accompanied by two members of the State Department who were clearly suspicious as to what their motives might have been. But we did a half-day seminar. The governor of our central bank also attended part of it. And towards the end, after I'd finished my presentation, the guy from the State Department said to me, "That's not what we expected." And I said, what do you mean? "Well, we weren't expecting you. We weren't expecting you to explain all of this. We were expecting something completely different." And this was at a time, I think, where, there was some sensitivity, but off the top of my head, I said, "Well, who were you expecting? Osama bin Laden?" And everybody fell about laughing at that stage. But very often, I think the ability to communicate about and speak to the audience listening depends very much on where they're coming from or what they're perceived to be. And I've always been well accepted in the US, where I've spoken, European countries, but also increasingly over probably the last decade in the Middle East and all around Asia. And I think people are beginning to understand that you have an in-depth knowledge, but you also see things slightly differently, and you're not meeting the expectations. The expectations very often are that you're going to see, and I make apologies to both of you first, because you're both having a beard. They're expecting people in a beard and a dish dasher to say all this stuff, and I don't fit the bill, and that's an opportunity, and I've been fortunate that I've been able to take a lot of those opportunities and explain some basic misconceptions to audiences that probably wouldn't have given, with all due respect to Mufti Faraz, wouldn't have given Mufti Faraz 5 seconds of airtime before him being removed from the stage for being whatever he looked like. Times are changing, but we need to change them. There's lots to do and not a moment to lose, as I like to say.
Indeed. And so on that note, in terms of the creation of awareness, education, pushing this movement further into the future and creating more adoption, how do we do that? And what role will the emerging tech play in that transition? Perhaps, who wants to go first, Mufti Faraz or Daud?
I'll go with it. I'll be very succinct on this. And I'll answer in part with an answer I gave probably 25 years ago. It's about education, perception, and liquidity. I was asked the question, what does Islamic finance need? And I was asked this pretty much close to 25 years ago. I still answer in the same way. Education is obvious, and education helps change perception. But liquidity is still an issue. The depth and breadth of the markets are still a concern, and we need to look at ways in which we can do that. what I find interesting now in terms of the way forward, the opportunities are with the adoption of technologies, and you know, a couple of things which have got my interest, and I'm actively involved in not only researching but supporting artificial intelligence and machine learning, and they can be they have the potential to be a huge democratizer, let's use that word, for the provision of finance, and particularly Islamic finance, to a broader range of people very, very quickly. I think the changes that are going to come are going to be fueled by these advances in technology, but they also need to be fueled by visionary foresight from experienced people who understand how operations work and the interactivity between markets and how those markets can be regulated in a good way. And by good way, I mean with good corporate governance. And I think we're going to be looking at some level of liberalization of markets. I don't think it's going to happen in a hurry, but eventually individual countries and individual markets are going to figure out that collectively they're a lot stronger than they are trying to regulate things from a country's perspective. But there are some things to overcome there, you know, like, you know, tax regimes in countries and how countries raise revenue and so on and so forth. But I do think there's a huge opportunity here for democratization of finance using the type of technology which Fasset has developed, but also enhancing the use of AI and machine learning. You know, if I'll wave a smartphone in front of you because I use it a lot. You think the first bit of programming I did in the 1970s when I first went into banking, and I'm not a technologist, but I had to do some programming because we had to do a bit of everything. I was helping to build a trading system, and our computer, and it was a Perkin-Elmer computer, had 128K of random access memory. And we built a trading system that did 15,000 trades a day. That takes programming skill. And that also means you have to understand how the processes work. I've got, I don't know how many gigabytes on this thing. I lose track of that. But just imagine we've come an awful long way. The skills I had to learn by touching all the paper, literally 50 years ago and more, can't be developed today. Nobody is going to be able to do what I do today because I touched all the paper and I did it in every continent apart from Antarctica. You understand how things work. So what are you going to do? You're going to have to use AI and machine learning to replace the kind of knowledge that my generation had of how things work together. I hope that gives you some sort of background, but it's exciting times, and that's why I like being engaged with this, because it's keeping my grey matter whirring over on a regular basis, which is not a bad thing.
Indeed, they are exciting times. And on that point, allow me to hand the mic over to Mufti Faraz and ask you as well, how are you seeing the technology landscape at the moment? And also in the context of Fasset, how do you see the Islamic finance space now developing and moving forward?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure if you've seen all the ads and all the kind of like social media posts on the Apple Vision Pro in America right now. It's going crazy. People are walking around in the streets with their headsets on, right? And that's really a glimpse of the future, what we're looking at, where people will be sitting, wherever you go, people will have these headsets, right? And there's connectivity, right? There's networking, there's scale, there's speed, there's efficiency, there's liquidity, there's diversity of assets, right? This is what Facet is all about, right? Facet, if we want to talk about Facet, I think one of the best ways to think of it is having the best of technology, right? With the best of intentions and the best of resources, putting all that together and bringing change. And that's what I think is at the heart of the Facet mission, right? Is how do we galvanize and how do we operationalize these immense power that we have at our disposal? And with AI coming now, quantum computing, There's talks of like nuclear fission. There's experiments taking place in the last couple of years in the US, right? Of nuclear power, right? Renewable technologies and renewable energies. You put all that into the mix, the future looks like, it can be completely different to what we see today. And that's really, we have to be ready for that and start planning for that. Not just for the sake of money and profit maximization. This is really important where the intentions come in, but really about optimization. How do we ensure we level the playing field? How we give more access? We make it more inclusive. How we create a network where, regardless of where you are, who you are, what you do, you're plugged in. You have opportunities, right? Because that's what riba, from a Sharia perspective, riba is all about that. This inequality that you have, lack of access and lack of ownership. That's what riba represents. And so if we were really to take on the Islamic message, it's doing this, what we're doing, to make that change. And that's what excites me the most. I would say in the next 10, 15, 20 years, we have immense opportunities with thought leaders like Dawood, right? Giving us that kind of real insights. He's been there, he's done it, he's seen it all, right? And then he can help us and say, no, this is the way to do it going forward. And that's what excites me in Fasset.
Thank you, Mufti Faraz. And on that point, the role that Fasset will now play going forward in the broader Islamic banking and finance world, just how important do you think Fasset is going to be in moving forward the whole space?
I mean,
well, let me take a stab at that. Or you, sorry, Mufti, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'd love it to hear from you. I was just about to say, if you answered better.
I think what it does is it provokes the conversation, and helps educate. These things are possible. In recent weeks and months that I've been working with Fasset and doing my best to assist, meeting regulators and businesses and in sovereign wealth funds, for that matter. They've got smart young people working for them. They've also got some wise old heads as well. And they are looking to break out of that. They're moving at different paces. But the likes of Fasset are stimulating a different type of question, and raising the challenges which are going to have to be raised and solved, and won't be solved unless we get greater awareness. So if you follow my logic here, if the likes of Fasset didn't exist, this would be what I would call an interesting coffee shop conversation between, a few old people who've been there and done that. What Fasset is doing is actually saying we've got practical means whereby we can do this stuff. And what I'm hearing from the other side of the table when we go into these conversations is that there's a recognition that that's the way it's going to go. But we've got some challenges. We've got challenges you mentioned about, tax equalization, around, how you regulate the capital market, around good corporate governance, around the product, et cetera, et cetera. We have the same situation today as we had nearly 30 years ago, where people jump to a conclusion. The moment you say something like cryptocurrency, people jump to conclusions. They have no idea what cryptocurrency is, but they think that's a bad thing. It's just the same as 30 years ago when people in Islamic finance were, what's the word? The bogeyman word was hedge fund, or a derivative. Nobody understood what a hedge fund did or what a derivative was at that time, but everybody jumped on the back and said this is a bad thing. We've got to get over that. The reason and how we get over that is by education. What we're doing right now is hopefully reaching out to people, not to give them all the answers, but encouraging people to actually think about it and work about it. In quite a bit of what I would call the executive training I do for boards and for senior members of the finance industry now, is getting away from the expectation that I'm going to provide the answers. Yeah, I've been there and done it, and I may have a few. I may not, but I've got some experience. What is important is getting them to think about how they understand how things work. what the basic building blocks are. Nobody's going to become an expert in blockchain overnight. Nobody's going to become an expert in crypto overnight. But understanding how these things put together, what the issues are around liquidity, around good corporate governance, around, shall we say, the regulatory environment where, cross-border regulation is sometimes quite a challenge and it stops you doing things, or it provides opportunities for irregularity in the market through arbitrage. And yeah, we've been there and done that before. But it's about fundamentally engaging in the conversation and encouraging people to stop and think. And I always say, go back to basics, because I don't do complicated stuff at all. It's basic building blocks. And if you can demonstrate those basic building blocks, and I must say that the way Fasset approaches that appeals to me because it is looking at it from a basic building block approach. I like it, and I like it because Mufti Faraz is on board, because as a Sharia scholar, he explains things in, I'll put it in my terminology, in words of one syllable that I can relate to, without having to sort of go back and say, I wonder what he was really meaning by that. You can have, and there are very good Sharia scholars out there who I've been fortunate enough to work with over the years and who are still practicing, who are able to explain these things in words of one syllable. But it's about getting that message across and finding a way forward, because doing it the way that we've been used to doing it isn't going to work for that much longer. We've got far bigger problems around sustainability and what I call planetary health, which covers the whole umbrella. These are the major challenges that we as a world and as humanity need to face up to. And the likes of Islamic Finance, combined with a company like Fasset, has a good chance of coming up with some realistic solutions pretty quickly.
Indeed, and I love the points that you make, particularly around the education piece as well, Dawood. And I think this episode, the first episode, is the perfect episode, because what it's done is teed up a number of necessary follow-up episodes whereby it's really just a teaser. We've covered a number of areas here that we're definitely going to have to follow up on and go into more detail on subsequent episodes. And so and I hope that viewers of the show will have piqued the interest of some people who are perhaps new to the space, and that you'll want to follow us and come and watch for further episodes and learn more and come with us on this journey. And what I'll do to wrap up the session is, because I promised the viewers earlier on that we would go into the future as well. Let's take ourselves 20 years into the future, a leap forward. And I'll start with you, Mufti Faraz. At that point in time, what are the things that you would like to look back and say that we've achieved in this space?
Yeah, it's a very good question. For me, I think the key thing is that humans become the main agenda, not money, right? If we can make sure that money serves human interests and not the other way around, where we are, ensuring debt has been decreased across the world, we're controlling consumption, war has reduced across the world, there's good health is prevailing everywhere, there's balance in the climate and in the environment. That's really what matters. And if we can achieve even some of those things in the next 20 years, that's a wonderful future, a very bright future for the next generation.
Thank you, Mufti Faraz. And Dawood, I'll hand you the mic to finish off.
I would echo those thoughts absolutely. I have a catch-all phrase which is very important. It's about planetary health, and it's about completely changing, a transformation of priorities back to humanity. And I'll leave it like that. I couldn't put it any more eloquently than Mufti Faraz.
I think it's a perfect statement, a perfect way to end what's been a fantastic session and a very, very interesting discussion. Allow me to first thank you both, gentlemen, for joining us on the show today in this first episode of the Frontier Finance series. Thank you, everyone at home, for watching the show. I hope you'll subscribe and follow and join us on this journey and tune into the next episode. For now, take care and see you soon.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.